In this weekly news roundup video, the COP26 climate summit is here, but has it already failed to achieve its goal? The UK accidentally runs a large-scale real-life experiment on the pandemic spread, and European fights continue, with France versus the UK and the EU versus Poland. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. After all the preamble and the code red style headlines, the UN climate conference COP26 is finally here. You may be wondering what it's for. I mean, what's expected to be different by the end that will make a substantive difference to the problem that it's trying to solve? If you believe its stated objective, then it should be able to keep the world on track for holding planetary warming below 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial temperatures. In order for that to be done, you would have needed China, Russia and India to join the rest in radically increasing their targets to match net zero by 2050, along with short-term solid commitments in line to achieve that goal. Well, we knew pretty well some time ago that wasn't going to happen. China is committed to continuing to increase coal consumption until around 2030, which means that regardless of what anyone else does, emissions worldwide will continue to rise. Russia has committed also to net zero by 2060, although whether Putin can be trusted to deliver even on that promise is a topic of some discussion. And India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has already said no to a 2050 pledge. Unlike China and Russia, India still has 115 million people in extreme poverty, so unsurprisingly it sees itself as having other priorities. So you're left with whatever can be done around those limitations. And the answer isn't nothing, but much of what can be done has already been pre-announced. So let's not ignore the fact that when work started in preparing for the COP26 summit, just 30% of the world's economy was committed to a net zero carbon pledge. Now, as the conference is nearly at the starting line, that number has risen to a substantial 80%. And that might be the only headline Boris Johnson gets to cling to after the conference is done. It's fair to say that some countries, indeed the UK itself, have begun the process of putting the policy flesh on the bones of that commitment, but for others it's just a case of promises. Well, for now anyway. So Australia has finally broken through with a promise, after much discussion and negotiation, to join the League of Nations signed up to the net zero by 2050 commitment. Is there the slightest hint of how it would expect to do that? Well, not by shutting down coal, obviously. Prime Minister Scott Morrison said that he would hit net zero the Australian way. And he said this: "Our plan backs Australians to achieve what they want to achieve when it comes to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Australians want to do that, and our plan enables them to do that. Our plan works with Australians to achieve this goal. Our plan enables them, it doesn't legislate them, it doesn't mandate them, it doesn't force them, it respects them." Sounds great. If any of the Aussie viewers of this channel can shed light on net zero the Australian way, I look forward to hearing about it in the comments. The United Arab Emirates was another startling new member of the club, the first Gulf petro state to commit to fully decarbonise its economy by 2050. It has bid to host the COP28 conference in 2023, so this seems to be something that it's serious about engaging. Like a number of the oil-producing nations, the UAE has been working for some time to diversify its economy, to retain its relative wealth in the inevitable future without fossil fuels. Saudi Arabia, a noted player at the conference in the group that has always tried to fend off or water down climate measures, has likewise signed up to a 2060 target. That's in terms of its own emissions, not in terms of the oil that it produces that people then burn in their own countries. It is the 10th largest emitter today. Various experts describe Saudi Arabia's net zero target as very welcome, but said it would be good to see plans, which I'm taking as the polite form of incredulity. That could be a moment of uncharacteristic cynicism on my part. A lot of the focus, of course, has been on the US as well as the UK, as both of them this week have been grappling with the nitty-gritty of what gets funded Fine words are all very well, but what are you actually going to do? President Joe Biden had a huge, radical and expensive plan, and he has been locked into protracted and increasingly desperate negotiations to get his own party to agree to it. He insisted it had to be signed and sealed by COP26. However, when he stepped on his plane to leave the country, it had been launched, it had been announced, but no, it hasn't yet been agreed. Democrats are blaming moderates Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, who have been insisting that they won't vote for massive spending, and nor will they go with some of the anti-fossil fuel measures. But others have pointed out that, according to standard electoral mathematics, if you only win a narrow election victory, and even then by promising moderate centre-friendly policies, this doesn't actually win you a mandate for radical and expensive policies after the election. And it doesn't mean you can't try. George W. Bush, after all, refused to accept that the wafer-thin election margin that he had in 2000 put constraints on his freedom to try to implement his agenda. But if you can't carry it, that's not the fault of one or two people if you fail to get the majority that you needed. But it does severely weaken his presence at COP26 because he's now got the appearance of a man who talks big but can't deliver action. The UK budget, meanwhile, promised taxpayer money for nuclear power, largely to replace China's stake in the proposed Sizewell C plant. But it's also changed the way that how risk is managed in those projects in a way to try to encourage more investment from the private sector in nuclear. Otherwise, it mostly just annoyed environmentalists by cancelling a planned increase in petrol duty, given that, petrol prices are at a massive high right now, and reducing tax on short-haul flights while slightly increasing it on the longest-haul flights, a solution which satisfied nobody. Elsewhere, if you look at the world of business, you can see more of the solid action beginning to emerge rather than just the promises. So, for instance, Tesla this week hit a $1 trillion market cap when Hertz placed a massive order for 100,000 electric vehicles, saying that its customers just don't want to rent petrol cars anymore. And BP and Daimler have partnered together to produce hydrogen refuelling stations for heavy goods vehicles, looking to build an initial 25 stations in the next 9 years. Daimler aims to be selling hydrogen trucks to business operators by 2025, which doesn't mean to say that all the business actors have lined up behind the transition. So, for instance, the US corporate raider Daniel Loeb is calling for the Royal Dutch Shell company to be split up, separate out the legacy oil operations from the new renewables development. In principle, this would be a retrograde step. The idea that oil companies could make profits while managing the decline of fossil fuels comes by refashioning themselves as energy companies of the future, benefiting from the transition. If you separate them out, then you end up back with oil companies, whose interests are predominantly served by fighting tooth and nail against any transition. But this is the challenge, because during the boom years of the fossil fuel economy, shareholders in the oil majors enjoyed some pretty spectacular returns. And the thing is that some of Daniel Loeb's criticisms may well be correct, since transition is hard, and companies may fail to manage it well. His company was quoted in the Wall Street Journal saying that about Shell, too many competing stakeholders pushing the business in too many directions, leading to an incoherent, conflicting set of strategies. Maybe they're right. Shell, meanwhile, has been told that it's not welcome at COP26, presumably along with all the other oil companies. The chief executive of Shell pointed out that you needed to continue to develop some oil assets, even in the process of net zero. He said that the high energy prices we're seeing right now shows what happens if the world curbs fossil fuel supplies before curtailing demand. And that's absolutely right, obviously. One reason why you probably shouldn't be afraid to have those voices at your summit. In other news, there's been an unintended real-life experiment in the UK on the pandemic, which the government seems intent to ignore. We'll get to that and some of the rest of the news in just a minute. But first, the UK government upset a bunch of people with its net zero strategy by not including anything about pushing people to eat less meat. When challenged on it this week, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak said unambiguously, "I won't tell Britons to eat less meat," and to drive the point home, he appeared at a meat market for one of his post-budget interviews. Some people found that hard to swallow. The government's chief scientific advisor, Patrick Vallance, said that a reduction in the amount of meat that you eat was one of the key changes that you could adopt and should adopt. He was launching a letter from 40 government scientific advisors from around the world, which said that there needed to be significant behavioural transformations. Vallance said that he'd reduced his own meat consumption. The head of the Committee on Climate Change, Chris Stark, said that he had also given up red meat completely. Are they right? And is this the right message for the moment? I will be looking at that in the deep dive video to go live on Monday next week on this channel. Join me for that. Last week, various figures were lining up to call for the UK government to move to Plan B, more COVID restrictions in the face of rising case numbers. This week, we've seen the mainstream scientific establishment stepping forward to confirm that all their modelling actually predicts falling figures very soon, even without those actions. Epidemiologist John Edmonds, one of the government's SAGE committee advisors, said that the virus is spreading primarily amongst school-aged children who hadn't been vaccinated. And he said that if you looked at all three of the different groups that have been modelling the short-term future with the virus, he said this: if you take the consensus, we all feel that we might see cases either levelling off or falling in the next few weeks. The epidemic in the last few months has really been driven by huge numbers of cases in children, and that will eventually lead to high levels of immunity. Of course, it's not always easy to tell exactly how things are playing out in the very short term. For instance, some of the data on cases suggested that they may have been falling in children before the half-term school holidays which have arrived. But some have also pointed out that families might be simply avoiding tests as the holidays got nearer, so as to reduce the risk of a positive test, meaning that they would have to cancel their holiday. Speaking of working the figures to try to see what's going on, there was another interesting note that I saw this week from the Times' science editor Tom Whipple about an inadvertent experiment that the UK has just run. The southwest region of the country has seen cases going up far more quickly than the rest of the country for no apparent reason. But this was also the region being served by a COVID testing laboratory that had a catastrophic failure, leading to 40,000 people being told that they didn't have COVID when actually they did. That's 40,000 people who should have been quarantining, who instead were mingling and who knows what level of carousing they get up to in the southwest. If those two were linked, you would have a real-life experiment right there, demonstrating the difference that testing and isolation actually makes. The difference between what happened in the rest of the country, where people got tested and changed what they did as a result, and those that believed that they were clear and carried on as normal. The only thing is that Number 10, the Prime Minister's office, were asked if these two were linked, and they simply said, "We don't believe that they are." No explanation as to why they wouldn't be linked, no alternative theory as to why the rate shot up. It looks to the unpracticed eye, which is the only kind of eyes that I have, as though they just wanted to avoid any sense of them being responsible. Lab error is a system thing that maybe they would or should be held accountable for. But here's the thing. If they were right, and a major failure of test and trace made no difference to the real world numbers, then the implication is that all that money being spent on testing is completely wasted. More likely, they're just shifting the blame. Yet another disappointment for those of us who would like to expect that those running the country would tell the truth and hold themselves accountable. Not that it's the only thing that the government has to worry about. For instance, France is ratcheting up the pressure in its dispute with the UK over fishing. The UK summoned the French ambassador for a telling off when the French seized a British vessel that they said was breaking the rules. France has said that it will ban all British seafood imports from next week in retaliation for the government's decision not to grant more licences to French trawlermen to fish in British waters. And that's no small deal for British fishermen, since France was Britain's biggest export market for fish back in 2019, making up more than a quarter of exports. In addition, it's to increase customs checks on lorries moving between the UK and France, aiming to increase delays. And it may also push up the price of the electricity supply provided by France to the Channel Islands. These measures are being considered unilaterally by France because the EU has so far declined to support it in the dispute. Not everyone seems convinced that the French case is as watertight as they suggest. From a French perspective, of course, there are presidential elections coming up. This sort of dispute is one where Macron has a strong interest in being seen to defend the interests of his fishing industry. The EU, meanwhile, is pursuing grievances of its own, this time with Poland. I talked last week about how Poland's challenge to the EU's rules was creating a furious storm, and it decided to take action this week by fining Poland €1 million per day in a ruling by the EU Court of Justice. Why the fine? Poland set up a controversial disciplinary chamber of its Supreme Court in 2018. The government argued it was there to fight corruption in the court, but others say that it's there to punish judges who don't toe the government's line. 3 months ago, the European Court of Justice ordered it to be shut down because it didn't reflect an independent judiciary. Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said that the EU did not have jurisdiction over Poland's constitutional matters. He did agree to wind down the chamber, but while it stopped scheduling new cases, it is still continuing to hear previously scheduled ones. €1 million per day is small change compared to €57 billion of COVID-19 recovery funds that Poland is due to receive. Even then, Poland has said that it won't pay the fine. However, that enormous COVID payment is likely to be held up until this dispute is resolved, and that amount of money may well be what talks in the end. This is just the latest round of the ongoing escalation between Poland and Hungary as well, on the one hand, and the EU on the other, as they push back against the European stated ideal of ever greater union. We will see more of this. Now, whatever other claims you've heard about climate change, it's fair to say that a former Japanese Prime Minister just came up with one which is truly extraordinary. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But first, it's nearly November, and that means it's nearly time for the November live stream. I will be reviewing some of the topical issues of the moment, responding to a few comments or questions that I've had on recent videos, and of course, taking your questions live from the chat. So join me for that at 7 p.m. UK time, Wednesday next week. See you then. And if you've made it this far, it's surely time, if you haven't already, to hit that like button to help feed the YouTube algorithm gods, and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell as well if you've not done that already. You know, it makes sense. The Japanese Prime Minister apologised after one of his senior politicians said that there were good things about climate change. For instance, it had made Japanese rice more delicious. This was Taro Aso, a former Prime Minister himself, no less. Was this one of these ridiculous examples where the orthodoxy jumps on anyone who says that there might be some positive impacts of climate change? Well, no, not really. More someone ignoring all the good work that had been done by Japanese farmers to improve rice varieties and giving all the credit instead to the climate. Could have been worse. In 2014, Taro Aso said that he thought that Hitler had good motives. That one also didn't go down well. In other news, the BBC recently ran a feature about how some transgender women who still have biologically male bodies are pressuring and coercing lesbians to have sex with them. In response, more than 16,000 people signed a letter of protest accusing the corporation of transphobia for running the story. The BBC article quoted 3 anonymous women who said that they'd faced a backlash for saying that they're only attracted to women who are biologically female. Now, the issue with this article shouldn't be whether or not such a practice is socially acceptable. The line, "if you don't have sex with me, that means you're a bigot," Maybe the chat-up line preferred by some? I would go instead with the general life principle that if someone is trying to guilt you into sex, whoever they are and on whatever basis, the answer is hell no. That counts as my first and probably only ever instance of relationship advice on this channel. What we don't know is whether this is a real problem or whether there's just a handful of total jerks who are trans women, and that then gets talked about and amplified as a wider problem than it is, which is the claim of the letter signatories. Now, there was a TikTok video of one idiot doing the social media rounds. Here's an excerpt of that.
If you're cis and you won't date trans folks, you're transphobe.
But a handful of idiots online does not make a crisis. It could be that the BBC focused on a non-problem, not the first time it's ever done that, let's be honest, but even if it did, that's still some way short of the 16,000 signatory letter which called the report incredibly dangerous. Well, no, it's not incredibly dangerous to say this sort of behaviour is abusive and wrong, even if it turns out to be extremely rare. Finally, Insulate Britain campaigners were back to blocking roads again this week, and a number of news outlets reported how one fed-up motorist sprayed the road blockers with ink. Lots of people seem to approve of this action. As someone who has done nothing but condemn those protests, I am not one of them. I didn't support the idiots who were throwing milkshakes over Brexit campaigning politicians a couple of years ago. I said then that that was assault and should not be encouraged. And well, this time, different target, but exactly the same principle. You should either agree with both or, like me, disagree with both. You shouldn't applaud it when it's against someone you don't like and call foul when it's someone you do. I've played enough tennis in my life to know only too well the difference between playing to win and playing not to lose. It's a well-known thing within sports. When you play confidently, you go for your shots as though you expect to make them, then you will play better, even if sometimes you don't make those shots. But if, when you're under pressure, you start trying not to make mistakes rather than trying to hit good shots, then you do actually, bizarrely, end up playing a lot worse and ironically making a lot more errors. It's almost as if when you say to your brain, don't miss, it only hears the second word of the phrase. I think the self-same dynamic in how we think can apply at the societal level as well. I thought about this recently with a recent statement by the actress Joanna Lumley. Now, I have a lot of time for Lumley. She stood up for and campaigned for the rights of the Gurkhas and made a real difference for them. This wasn't just, celebrities taking popular causes for a bit of virtue signalling. This was supporting a group of people with fierce determination to right a pretty grievous injustice, which they did. So I'm not going to be indulging in mockery here. But nevertheless, she said something I believe to be profoundly wrong. She evoked the idea that we should go back to some system of rationing in order to tackle climate change. She suggested a point system where people would be given climate credits. And she said she was motivated by the fact of how much people in the West waste. There are lots of people in the Western world who are jolly poor. But largely it's the Western world that stuffs its face and chucks stuff away and doesn't care. This is the playing not to lose mentality. It's the same mentality that drove the Health and Safety Society and the EU overly precautionary principle of saying no to anything new because everything has a downside. It's the successor to Malthusianism of the past. The idea that having worked out how to raise ourselves from poverty, to apply scientific processes to understand so much about how the world works and how we ourselves work, that the way to respond to a challenge to that progress is to turn around and head back down the chain. Now, I'm aware this could be a convenient argument to cover, ongoing gluttony and rapaciousness, but you judge people by their actions. A majority of people who are actively engaged are keen to solve the problems of waste, solve the problems of impact on habitats, and of course on the climate. In the same way that we faced declining fertility in the soil in the 1900s and solved it with innovation, and we faced low yields of crops in places like India in the 1970s and solved it with innovation, playing to win is assuming that the same creative power can solve these new problems. Huddling down in the dark, scared to move for fear of failing, is not how those problems are going to be solved. And here's the thing, whether you think the human race should step back from wanting high quality of life or not, it's not gonna. It's just not. So at some point, you have to commit to going all in and saying we are focusing on the application of energy and optimism and creativity, because that is the only way these problems have ever been solved in the past. Taking that attitude will make you a better tennis player and will enable us all the possibility of realising the potential inherent to a species that alone throughout the history of the world has become self-aware and defined by our ability to solve the problems that face us. All right. Navarra Media is a YouTube channel for centre-left commentary and discussion. I'd never really come across them before this week, but I heard of them because on Monday YouTube took their channel down. Boom! Just like that. No free strikes and you're out, just wallop. And they got this notice. We have reviewed your content and found severe or repeated violations of our community guidelines. Because of this, we have removed your channel from YouTube. And if it does that, you're not allowed to access or create any other YouTube channels. Now, they kicked up a fuss. People on the left and on the right on Twitter, who agree on very little else, nevertheless agree that YouTube shouldn't just be taking channels down without explanation. And it quickly got reinstated, with no explanation. Any channel creator who deals with sensitive issues is going to look at that and wonder if they're next. And if they are, will that YouTube process respond as positively if you can't mobilise a significant amount of public protest? It all just feels a little bit arbitrary, but in the spirit of playing to win and not playing to lose, we have to continue covering the questions that are difficult and interesting and ignoring these sorts of concerns, assuming that whatever happens, it can be fixed. As always, I would like to thank the supporters of this channel on Patreon. Without your support, I wouldn't be able to take that approach, and I wouldn't be able to put the time into creating this content or tackling some of the issues that I do. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Do bear in mind, Patreon takes payments on the 1st of the month. We're nearly at the end of the month, so you might well want to wait until the 1st of next month before signing up so you don't get hit in quick succession twice. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is The Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.